Thanks for tuning in for today for part 2 of our presentation on the ketogenic diet. If you'd like to view part 1 of this presentation or any of our previous webinars, you can view them on our YouTube channel at www.youtube.com/The Johnson Center. Check out our website to view a list of upcoming free webinars. Just go to www.johnson-center.org, then click on the webinars link on the right-hand side. You can also join our email list there and stay up to date on all events and opportunities by clicking on the Join Our Email List link on the homepage. We also post news to our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter accounts, and these are great sites to stay up to date on news like scholarships, research news and opportunities, events, and more. Our next webinar will be a 3-part series in April on anxiety, sleep, and depression. We currently have some terrific support programs, including support and sliding fee scales for diagnostic services, counseling support, and more. If you'd like more information, please contact us at info@johnson-center.org. Be sure to follow our colleagues at the Autism Research Institute, as they also host several great webinars and share some great resources on their website and social media pages. If you would like a certificate of attendance after today's webinar, look for a follow-up email in your mailbox 1 hour after the webinar concludes, or look for the link on our YouTube channel in the webinar description. It will contain instructions on how to get your certificate. If you have questions during the live webinar, please type them into your GoToWebinar control panel or email info@johnson-center.org. If you are watching a recording of this webinar, you may email questions to the presenter at info@johnson-center.org. Today's webinar is presented by our Clinical Director, Kelly Barnhill. Kelly is a certified clinical nutritionist with over 15 years of experience working with children with autism and related disorders. Kelly is also on the Science Advisory Board for the Autism Research Institute and has authored several research papers related to nutrition and autism. She is a sought-after presenter, speaking at several national and international conferences each year. We are happy to have her speaking here today, so without further delay, please welcome Kelly Barnhill.
Thank you so much for joining us. This is part 2 of our look at the ketogenic diet and its application specifically in those with autism spectrum disorder. If you joined us for part 1 and still have some outstanding questions, this would be a great time for you to send along those questions about rationale for the use of this diet or historical purpose for the use of the diet or any clarification that you need from the information that we presented last time, and we can start prioritizing that to discuss in the Q&A time that we have today. If you haven't seen that and are just joining us today for the first time, welcome, and know that today I really want to go through 3 areas of ketogenic usage in a pediatric population with special needs. And the first thing I want to talk about is the types of food that are appropriate and give you just some overview and very gentle, easy ideas about where to find resources on putting appropriate foods together and how to do that well. In talking about diet, I'll be referring both to a classical ketogenic approach, a ketogenic using MCT oil, and also a modified Atkins diet. So I'll be covering foods that are applicable in all of those approaches. And my goal really is to give you ideas about foods that you can include in the diet, but not give you any specific dietary plan, because those plans need to be tailored to an individual's nutritional needs. But any of the components that we go over are things that would be applicable to any individual following a modified Atkins diet, an MCT oil added diet, or a classical keto diet, except and barring any allergy or intolerance issues that individual families are following. The second thing I want to spend some time talking about today is baseline clinical assessment and how to look for the right information when choosing to start a ketogenic diet or a modified Atkins diet, things that your clinicians should be looking for carefully. As this has become more commonplace, we have more and more neurologists who are willing to support the use of dietary intervention for children that they see, and in doing that, they may or may not refer to a dietitian or nutritionist for dietary management. And with this set of information, it empowers parents as clients and recipients of that knowledge to be able to ask informed questions of their practitioners in terms of laboratory assessment prior to beginning and dietary needs, etc. And for practitioners, it offers you kind of a roadmap towards what do I really need to understand fully before I begin this approach for a child that I'm working with. And the last thing I want to spend time on today is nutritional supplementation, because I think that's something that we don't necessarily pay enough attention to when we start talking about an approach like this. And it's really important for us to be looking at the big picture. And I want to give you some background information on why we do that and what those supplements look like, and the things, again, that you need to be thinking about when you either recommend or supervise or implement one of these approaches. So I think that's it for now in terms of kind of the overview. Let's just get started. So what foods are safe on a ketogenic diet? Families ask this frequently, and I go back to the same basic questions and the same basic foods that we recommend for kids following any approach, whether it's a specific carbohydrate diet or a gluten and casein-free diet or a diet without any dietary restrictions. You want food that looks like food, as close as it is to when it came here. So if you're talking about protein, ideally you want something that, if it's animal protein, is minimally processed, is either organic, grass-fed, etc. If you are talking about fats, you want to look at full fats that are healthy. You want to look at that are not trans fats. And for carbohydrates, you want to look at things that are primarily fruits and vegetables with limited grain exposure if you're not following one of these diets. So for a ketogenic diet, the caveat here really is lots of full fat foods, lots of fats, proteins across the board, and carbohydrates that come from fruits and vegetables. And we eliminate, in our approach, we eliminate grains and any processed carbs that we're talking about there. And I'll tell you, as this diet has become more popular, there are more carbohydrate options out there now, and we can use those in certain circumstances, but we'll kind of cover that later. So what does food look like that we're preparing for a ketogenic diet? In terms of animal products, you want to use wholesome lard, tallow, ghee if you don't have a concern with any potential contamination with casein protein in that. And those all provide healthy fats for this diet. In terms of other fats, look at olive oil, coconut oil, red palm oil. Nut oils are really good. Coconut milk and coconut cream tend to be really good. And then MCT oils, which are often used now more and more in terms of supporting fat intake to be able to get to that appropriate fat calorie level and also a ratio level on a classical diet. And there are a lot of those out there now as well. Those are typically derived from coconut oil. So which proteins? Any animal protein that your child is non-responsive to. So beef, chicken, fish, shellfish, any form of poultry, so turkey, duck, any form of bison. Be creative with the proteins that once you're comfortable in what you're working with. Any nuts you can use, but you have to be careful because your carbohydrate content can increase quickly if you start supporting with a lot of nuts and nut-based products. Eggs are a great healthy protein that can be used as you initiate this, and you can rely on those more as you begin to rotate other things in. And there are other protein powders that can be used in a pinch to increase that protein to a level that we need it to be. And more products are coming out every day that are keto friendly, keto appropriate, keto approved. And we'll talk about those a little bit later too. Now let's talk about carbs. The graphic on the right gives you a little bit of information on keto-friendly carbs, starting from the bottom on the way up. You can get more in terms of quantity. If you start at the bottom, you get more quantity in the serving, or you can have more servings. And as you move toward the top of that scale, portion size decreases because the carbohydrate content increases. I suggest that a lot of my families that I work with familiarize themselves with a website called dietdoctor.com. It has a lot of resources in terms of that are very visual in being able to help you decide, okay, these are keto appropriate and keto friendly fruits and vegetables that I can include right now. And then when I move into a different phase of modified Atkins, for example, or we're increasing carbohydrate content just a little bit, these are other things that I can try. And that should give you a good starting point. And then work with your clinician or practitioner to seek out specific use in terms of portion size, quantity size, and ratios for the individual. So one big question that we get a lot is, what about a gluten and casein-free ketogenic diet? And it's absolutely possible. As people, as things have become more and more popular with ketogenic across the board in recent years, there are many, many high-quality commercial products available that are dairy and gluten-free and also meet the criteria for keto. I say that, and my caveat is some of those products you need to be careful with, because as they are capitalizing, I think might be too harsh, but as there's been this surge of interest in a ketogenic diet for the population at large, there are many manufacturers who are moving into this industry and producing products that don't quite meet that whole healthy, whole criteria that we kind of use as a baseline for beginning a dietary intervention for anyone. So just be careful in looking at those packaged products. I also caution you that I've seen more and more products that say keto friendly, but when you read portion size and carbohydrate content, you realize that the net carb count is significant and could be, in one little cookie, could be more than 50% of total carbs for the day. And so while it might meet the criteria for a keto diet, it also kind of uses up your carb supply in, you know, a 1.5-inch round cookie, which defeats the purpose in my opinion. And so there are other ways that we can find treats and things like that that are appropriate without, you know, utilizing more than half of a daily supply of carbohydrates to get there. In terms of GFCF specifically, I think that it requires initially a little bit more management and a careful initiation, simply because if your child, regardless of current gluten and casein-free status, so if they're on a current GFCF diet or if they're transitioning to one, you're going to face different challenges in being successful with a keto approach. If the child is not on a GFCF diet, you may have difficulty introducing foods that they may not have been exposed to before. If your child has been on a prescribed and managed GFCF diet and has been exposed to some different foods that are going to be seen in a ketogenic approach, things change because you'll start navigating, okay, how much is too much? What do we, you know, of familiar foods and things like that. So different barriers to success in both populations, and that's why having a strong relationship with a practitioner, a mentor, and other people in the community that you can rely on to problem solve with is really helpful. Typically, a gluten and casein-free diet requires the use of MCT oil support initially, at least for the first 3 or 4 weeks as you begin to transition in, just to get to the necessary criteria for fat intake on a traditional ketogenic diet. If you look at ketogenic diets as they have been applied over the past, through the 1990s, really, before it became a much more popular intervention and utilized for different things other than its original intention of inpatient care for significant seizure activity. The primary source of fat was cow's milk, cow's cream. And that had a wealth of both fat and also protein content, and it was concentrated from a nutrient-dense perspective. So you could easily get to a place of loaded fat intake without using the oils that we're using today. So to kind of shift that and change that balance without using a product like that, we can bring in some coconut milk, and coconut cream, but to really get there, we need that MCT oil. So the downside of introducing, and I mentioned this the last time, the downside of using a straight MCT oil to get there is that it can create an initial disturbance GI-wise, whether it's nausea or diarrhea or just discomfort, because the body's just not used to having such immediate access to a high quality fat from a nutrition perspective. And that's something to transition into slowly. So with children that we work with, we start with baby steps, introducing that oil before we go into a strict diet so that the oil can be better tolerated as we begin to increase that dose. So as you're thinking through this now, if you have questions about GFCF status, if you have questions about dietary components specifically, let me know. I'm going to shift gears now and talk a little bit about baseline clinical assessment, just to give you some information on clinical management of a ketogenic diet. So ideally, you work with a clinician to determine the best plan forward, and you really need access to someone who is familiar with and has managed diets over time and understands the nuances of shifting cream content to MCT content, for example, and can interact with and work with a supervising physician, for example, to be able to give you the best plan for success and moving forward. Because as with every diet that we use when we're intervening with the children that we serve, we can do tons and tons and tons of work, and if we miss one step, we might not get full benefit from that. So I strongly encourage you to consider having a physician involved in the decision to begin something and having a supervising clinician, dietitian, nutritionist who has experience in doing this help you make the best plan forward. So for me, really the first thing is to get all the baseline data. So we gather everything we can to begin with, then we develop a diet plan and a strategy, and then we develop a supplementation plan. For labs, this kind of gives you perspective on the way that I think about gathering data that could be important as we begin to drastically shift the body's fuel source from glucose to ketones. I like to have just baseline data, so a blood count, metabolic panel, vitamin D. We also like to order iron and ferritin panels. Trace minerals, serum trace minerals such as selenium, phosphorus, zinc, and magnesium are kind of important. And this is primarily because many of the kids who initially started using the ketogenic diet or a version of it to manage and intervene in autism also had a diagnosis of seizures, and they were on either an anticonvulsant or they were on some medication that also needed management. And when you start looking at loading and changing fuel sources in the body in conjunction with a medication, we need to be extremely cautious with how we move forward. So for many of the children who we work with, they've already completed these baseline labs before we ever see them. They've done this as part of a workup to identify any metabolic concerns or mitochondrial issues, but we'd also want to look at uric acid levels. We'd want to do a full urinary amino acid profile and also a serum amino acid profile. particularly looking at carnitine and acylcarnitine because those are involved in fat metabolism specifically. And we want to know what that looks like. So do we need to augment? Do we need to alter? Is it an option to begin this intervention, or is it something we need to hold off on without medical management? And we would also want to look at a urinalysis with a baseline, a comprehensive urinalysis that looks at glucose and will also give us a baseline ketone profile. And I would encourage you, as someone thinking about prescribing this, recommending this diet, or a parent thinking about implementing it, to discuss these labs with your practitioner. It cannot hurt to get too much information at the beginning so we can accurately assess the best path forward and also progress along the way. So other additional baseline and data diagnostics, et cetera, that we might want to gather would be an EEG. Often neurologists, when they recommend a dietary intervention or agree to a dietary intervention in conjunction with anticonvulsant therapy, they'll request a follow-up EEG to be able to evaluate impact of the dietary intervention. And if you have a neurologist that you're working with and you have documented seizure activity, you may want to consider following up to get something like that if it's been a while since that has been done. Sometimes kids need renal ultrasounds. That's primarily a function of medication involvement, and that's something that the neurologist would recommend if they're prescribing a ketogenic diet and there is a seizure component with medical screening. Same thing for the bone density screening. Many anticonvulsant therapies are an issue with and impact long-term bone, laying down bone in the body and the bone matrix. And getting a baseline bone density as we begin something like this is also important. And because when we start to layer therapies in with each other, and this is particularly in the case of any medication involvement, we just get all the data we need to make the best decision moving forward. So does that mean we need additional bone matrix minerals going in from the start? Does it mean that we retest in a few years? Does it, where are things, and what does that look like for us? And the last thing that I really like to do is gather information on the child's current diet. And sometimes families say, well, why is that necessary? Because it's going to change drastically. And there are a lot of reasons, but for me, the basics are, and the most important reasons are, I really like to see what the child's preferences are so that I can encourage and match those moving forward as much as possible. I like to see what the child's current calorie intake is like so that I can get close to that in terms of energy management for that particular child's needs. And most of the time, the children that we see, and there are exceptions, but most of the time, the children that we see are in an equilibrium of sorts where they're not, their growth is consistent. Despite where they fall on a growth chart, their growth is consistent over time. So while we do work with kids who are considered failure to thrive, or kids who have lost weight or fallen off the chart, it's kind of a different issue, and that's not what I'm speaking to right now. I'm just saying in general, when we look at this, it's easy to glean okay, this child needs 1,800 calories a day because he's been able to maintain his weight trajectory and his height trajectory over time with that level of intake for the past 2 years, something like that. So after all that data is together, then we sit down with families and talk about meal planning and meal prep. And really, in doing this, I just want to review what we talked about last time so that you have these images in your head. Image on the left side of the screen kind of outlines the current content of carbs in our diet on average, and that's the average American child. The Western diet is carb heavy and protein and fat light. A ketogenic diet at the top on the right is total 10% content protein, carbs, huge content of fat, and the modified Atkins kind of falls in between and is more a function of total carbohydrate intake rather than ratio. So we're moving from this huge intake of carbs, red, on the left to really restricted carbohydrate intake on the right. And I just want to give you some really basic ideas about what works moving forward, because it's really tweaking things that you might be doing already. And often when I meet with families, they'll say, oh, well, I really need to eat, I follow X plan because this plan makes me feel better, or I am trying to eat paleo and I don't know that I could do this diet for my child too. And I just want to reassure you that it can be easy. And once you're kind of in there with your sleeves rolled up and thinking about which foods are on the okay list in various points in time, it gets so much easier just in managing ratios. And also, okay, these are the 15 things that we can have for breakfast this morning. I know how to put them together now. And it looks very similar to what we were eating 2 weeks ago. So for example, with a breakfast, I try to work on rotating from the very beginning when we begin any diet, so that you're not, so that you're offering different things at each meal all the time. But breakfast that is keto friendly, modified Atkins friendly, chicken sausage, either homemade or there are clean ones available out there, eggs and sauteed greens. Many families will say, okay, my kid won't eat sauteed greens, and that's okay by me. Let's try a different low carb vegetable and put it in there instead. And I strongly encourage families to begin with vegetables at breakfast. So put some carbs in there, because particularly as families begin dietary intervention and we're decreasing a child's carbohydrate source and then sending them off to therapy or school, we are robbing them of their known energy source, and they can get very tired as they begin to kind of convert from glucose management to working on fat as fuel. So think about that and consider putting low net carbohydrates into every breakfast that a child is exposed to from the very beginning, and it helps. So an omelet could work with avocado and asparagus. A frittata works in the same way. You can look at homemade coconut milk yogurt with berries. Berries to begin with are, and once you go into and start learning more about keto, berries are a good source of fruit-based carbs. They're also a really great source of a number of different phytonutrients. Portion sizes are small, and so you need to start looking at what a portion size would be, but they are absolutely appropriate. The portion is just going to look different. Poached eggs with avocado are an option. And I encourage families to, when we do this, we go through and go, these 5 things work. Now, what are variations on this that work for your family and the way that you like to eat? And we start to build plans forward from there. So lunches can include a protein, an animal-based protein or not, a hard-boiled egg with a salad and green beans and tomatoes, a turkey burger patty with avocado slices and asparagus prepared in an oil, meatballs with zucchini noodles and an avocado cream sauce, or that's a favorite of kids that we work with, but it doesn't have to be fancy. A grilled chicken breast with any approved vegetable in the appropriate quantity, with berries on the side. There are more and more recipes out there, and so it's easy to get distracted thinking, oh, I have to prepare and I have to have, it's a process and a meal, but there are many, many really simple meals that meet the criteria of a ketogenic intervention too. So if you have a child who likes grilled chicken nuggets, if you choose to prepare those at home, there's one menu component that you're already there and can check the box on. Okay, we have a safe fat source and a safe protein source for this child now. In terms of dinners, rotating things in are also a really good option. And really, it's the basic stuff: proteins, carbs, and fats. And the carbs are primarily in the form of vegetables, but can also be included in terms of quantity to a lesser extent as fruits. And start with, just what I've shown you here, 3 to 5 meals for each meal. and flesh those out as you begin to plan and process and move forward. So there's a big question right now in my mind and others about prepared keto products, because there is so much out there. And I mentioned this earlier, that when you read the fine print, yes, it's keto friendly, but is it keto wise? And often I find myself going, no. But I'm always encouraged when I do find products that are available. There are a number of really good products available through Amazon. There are a number of keto products that are available through Thrive Market. And as an educated consumer, when you begin going in and reading labels, and you have information on what your total carbohydrate intake should be or what dietary content is, you can easily begin to parse through which products there would work or not. So I'm saying that to speak to things like healthy nuts and seed products, jerkies, turkey jerky, beef jerky, bison jerky, fish jerky, all of those things you have to read the bottom line on, because they often add components that are not compliant, or they add components that then suddenly make the portion size very small. But those are options. There are also now, because the diet is so popular, there are options for meal service and meal delivery. So the big ones are out there that everybody knows about, but other ones include factor75.com, ketonedbodies.com, ketofridge.com, and all of those have meal plan, meal much like HelloFresh, where they show up on your doorstep in a cooler ready to serve. And once you have a child, the downside is if you're dealing with a child who has preferences about diet, you move into the diet first, and then you can shift to using things like that in a pinch. Many children that we work with move quickly to opening up their diets, as always seems to be the case when we move into a different dietary protocol. But either way, I think it's a great resource for families who travel, families who are visiting friends and relatives over the holidays. And more of these options are available every month. Like we see samples, we get notifications here on, oh, try this product, or oh, we are starting to provide keto meals as well. So as long as a consumer, we're paying attention to what we're actually purchasing and making sure that we're reading beyond the marketing on the top of it, I think that we have great options out there now that we didn't have even a year ago. Other things like in terms of snacks, because I think snacks are really important for kids, and I recommend approaching a modified Atkins diet or a keto diet in the same way I do a specific carbohydrate diet, and that is we're changing fuel source, and we're changing a child's need and desire for those complex carbs that they might be accustomed to, and so they're going to be hungry and irritable. And the way that we can avoid that is by trying to maintain satiety across the day as much as possible, and that is offering a snack 2 to 2.5 hours after breakfast that has protein and fats in it, offering a snack 2 to 2.5 hours after lunch to get through the afternoon, offering a bedtime drink or smoothie that might help assuage any nighttime concerns. And most of the kids that we work with, that snack plays a critical role also in getting to the total fat content and total caloric content of a successful intervention. So I wanted to just touch briefly on the impact of ketogenic diets on the GI tract and give you some references that I don't think I provided last time. There are a number of papers that are out in the past 2 years that are focused on what happens in the gastrointestinal system when we begin a ketogenic diet to change neurology. And that's something that really hasn't been studied before, but these papers are all out there looking at the microbiome and how changing the fuel source can be beneficial in children both with seizures and also those with autism. So I just wanted to include that because I think I neglected to do so last time. Apologies. I also want to spend some time now on that third component that I mentioned, and that is talking about nutritional supplementation. Okay, number one baseline for us is looking at multivitamin and multimineral support for all kids that we serve. I think it's particularly important for kids who move into a keto approach, and that's many kids that we see are already on one, and we either maintain that or change therapeutic levels. And I just say here that the two things that I think are important are that you need to look at that multivitamin in conjunction with any additional mineral support, which I'll touch on a little bit later. But that mineral support could either be trace mineral support or bone matrix building support. And also, ideally, a multivitamin which contains water-soluble vitamins needs to be dosed throughout the day. And realistically, for the families that we see and serve, that means breakfast and midday or breakfast and right after school, but typically not after 3 or 4 in the afternoon, because those B vitamins will then interfere with bedtime and sleep. So beyond that, we look at essential fatty acids, and most families who have used an essential fatty acid, EPA and DHA support, want to continue it, and we use it as a component of most diets that we start with kids. So it's something that we evaluate individual needs for, and frankly, I think we have enough data out there that tells us in a Western diet we're all deficient in omega-3s. And omega-6s are also important and beneficial in many ways as well. So we kind of look at supplemental oils here, and it has to be evaluated in the context of increased fat intake through the diet as well. And so you want to make sure that if you're thinking about that as a component of a nutritional protocol, you're also including total fat milligram intake or gram intake from that in the calculation of dietary fat intake. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but we really like to get information on acylcarnitine and L-carnitine when we begin a fat heavy diet like a keto or modified Atkins. And we consider supplementing with acetyl L-carnitine and also L-carnitine because it assists the body and the brain in utilizing the fat for energy. So it helps everything become more efficient in this process. And anything that we can do to maximize the benefit from that, I'd like to do. So that's a supplement that we typically consider for those who are going into and onto a ketogenic and or a modified Atkins diet. Another thing to think about would be electrolyte management. Electrolyte balance is important, particularly if you're looking at a classical keto approach where we need to be careful. For many kids, we talk about fluid intake and maintaining water intake and maintaining multivitamin, multimineral support. And for most kids, that's enough. Adding in an electrolyte support product that doesn't have any carbs in it isn't a bad option either, because you just know that you're covering any of those things that might become imbalanced as we change dietary energy sources. I also like to evaluate the need for or utility of digestive enzymes for those beginning a higher fat source diet. It can be difficult, like we've talked about. So if you're increasing the need to digest fats over what has happened in the past, you can create some GI discomfort, and providing that extra assistance by supporting with fat digestive enzymes can be helpful. These can be short term as you transition into the diet. They can be longer term if needed. Longer term for me typically means we have a child that we're tracking and we hope that we're in a weight gain and weight management program. So we're going to use that digestive enzyme to continue to maximize a child's ability to digest and absorb the fat that they're exposed to through diet each day. And for kids who we are doing this with, we track regularly and often, and we pick those digestive enzymes specifically to target what we're working on and choose the dose based on the dose of oil that we're using and the dose of fat that we're using. And we balance that with MCT oil, which kind of follows a separate pathway in some respect. So beyond digestive enzymes for fat, it's also interesting, and it's a conversation as a practitioner I think that's worth having. As a parent, it's a question to ask of yourself, and that is, am I going to be increasing my child's protein intake substantially as I begin this? You don't necessarily need to, but sometimes that happens because as you transition, the child will accept the protein offerings but decline many of the carbohydrate offerings, such as the greens or other vegetables that are appropriate. And suddenly you're in a place where the child will eat half a dozen scrambled eggs for breakfast, or, 6 sausage patties. And what do we need to do, and how do we address this increased protein intake and maximizing digestion and absorption of the nutrition there as well? So that's also a component to look at as you evaluate the need for and use of digestive enzymes when you begin this approach. Another thing that happens often and is sometimes counterintuitive is that when you begin this, despite the fat content of this diet, many kids can become constipated. So we manage fluid intake and promote as much clear, clean, good water intake as manageable. We use magnesium citrate or another form of magnesium that is well tolerated to promote bowel motility, and that helps continue to move things along as you transition. As you begin to increase MCT oil, that constipation impact decreases because the MCT oil tends to assist with bowel motility as well, as I've mentioned. And make sure that you're including fiber, which is something that if we can't get that in through vegetables, we need to evaluate the use of a supplement that's appropriate if we need to, at least short term. I've mentioned bone support, and we know that long-term use of anticonvulsants can weaken the bones and decrease laying down of bone matrix. And so we believe that practitioners should evaluate bone building support supplements on an individual basis. So child's age, child's need, any data such as a DEXA screening that we have. And we're not just talking calcium and vitamin D. You need all of this synergy bone support to maximize success in accessing and laying down bone structure for the long term. The last thing I really want to talk about in terms of nutrients is folic acid. And we know that seizure meds can interfere with absorption and metabolism of folic acid in the body. And there are things to think about moving forward are increasing appropriate forms of available folic acid in the body. So whether that is folinic acid or whether it's 5-MTHF, we need to choose those and likely augment and increase our dosages, particularly as women, girls enter their teen years, because decades of anti-seizure therapy, as you move into adulthood, depletes folic acid supply and can be problematic in pregnancy. So we know that a deficiency here slows an overall growth rate. We know it's associated with a number of problems like anemia and depression. I mentioned the pregnancy concerns earlier. So we like to track that from a dietary perspective and look at dietary intake. We look at multivitamin support for basic level, and then often we will load with additional 5-MTHF or folinic to be sure that we are meeting a client's nutritional needs for folic acid in the context of a diet and an anticonvulsant, anti-seizure med. So that's all I have that I wanted to get through today. I ran a little bit longer than I hoped to because I really wanted to have a lot of time to speak to questions. So I have a long list here already, and I'll just start getting to it. The first question I have is, my son is overweight. What foods do I choose on a ketogenic diet so that he doesn't gain more weight? And my response there is the foods that we choose for him will be in those same categories that we talked about for everyone. We would want the appropriate ratios, total energy intake, and what we would really want to manage is total caloric intake and exercise. But what's interesting is for many individuals who begin a ketogenic diet and are weary of, oh gosh, we're increasing fat content substantially, and I have a concern about weight already, it really becomes a non-issue once you move into the diet, because the use of ketones as fuel rather than glucose drives the body's metabolism in the brain. And as long as you're not overloading on dietary components and over the appropriate amount of caloric intake for a child, it shouldn't be an issue at all. And it can actually be quite beneficial in terms of energy levels for a child that you are concerned about decreased activity levels for example. I have another question asking, is this diet beneficial for children with high functioning ASD? And I think that's a great question. I think it all depends on the nature and purpose for choosing the diet. So are there gastrointestinal concerns involved? Does your child express discomfort or any GI concerns? Are there any behaviors that your child might be relating to GI discomfort or concerns? Do you feel like, have you worked with a practitioner who can help you fully evaluate the impact of this? If your child has a high functioning autism diagnosis and also comorbid seizure disorder and that is managed, I would say, yes, I think any child who's looking at a neurological concern like a documented seizure disorder needs to have a serious conversation with a knowledgeable practitioner about the pros and cons of dietary implementation and management in conjunction with and often leading to a decrease in medication over time, and decreasing the risks associated with that long-term medication use is always an appropriate question to ask in my mind. My orthopedic surgeon has recommended that I follow an anti-inflammatory diet as well as the keto diet, which my psychiatrist has recommended. Do you know how difficult it may be to combine both? They overlap quite a bit. If your orthopedic surgeon is talking about the AIP protocol, there's a great cookbook out now that looks at AIP and keto, and I'm sorry I don't have the name of it right now. But it is a great resource that kind of lines both approaches up side by side so that you can see where the very subtle differences are. And really, it's all about increased fat intake for keto or modified Atkins. Another question I have, is it easy to do keto and low histamine at the same time? And yes, it depends, but yes, it can be done. Again, we're layering things to avoid and eliminate on top as we move through this. But if we're talking about a low histamine diet, for me, it's always important that in addition to maintaining low histamine intake, we're also rotating that on a regular basis. So a 3-day rotation, a 4-day rotation, or even a 5-day rotation can be beneficial for those who truly need a low histamine approach. And if we do that, we create this food rotation that diminishes total exposure over a period of time and allows the body to respond and recover to the next food intake the following day on a rotational basis. And if we can set that up with foods that are tolerated, they can be quite successful when implemented together. Do you have any recommendations for starting the diet with a 13-year-old? We have done that. I have the same recommendations that I have with any dietary intervention, and that is the more family members who participate in any dietary change, the likelihood of success is higher because there are fewer chances for infractions, there are fewer chances for cross-contamination, there are fewer chances for hurt feelings associated with watching people eat things that you can't eat. Once you kind of wrap your brain around how you do that in your own family life, and if it's not possible, it's not possible. And I'm not speaking to the additional components of everyone following a strict keto, but dietary components can be the same at least. I think that it absolutely can be done with preteens and teens and older kids too. The tricky part there is getting their buy-in as you begin dietary intervention and offer them as much choice in that process as possible, to the extent that you're able. And I absolutely think it's worth a try. And moving toward a modified Atkins diet or a keto diet, even in baby steps, so that you're exposing to new foods all the time, can get you there. It just might take a little bit longer. Are baked goods made with almond flour inconsistent with a keto diet? And the answer is no, because almonds as a nut have some carbohydrate content, but also have protein and fat content that we want. What you have to be careful of is serving size, and that you're using a recipe that is not only keto friendly, but is also keto wise. So that means if you get a bar, for example, that is compliant with a paleo diet, for example, just make sure that you're looking at something that doesn't have added ingredients and sugars that are not consistent with a keto approach, and that it's a reasonable serving size. So you have to weigh that balance between, I know how to cook with almond flour and my child enjoys almond flour treats, with, okay, now he gets 1/4 inch of this every other day. How do we get other things in there? And often the shift there from an almond flour based product, which has to be in limited supply, is to what are now called keto fat bombs, which you can find recipes all over the internet for. And those are often like keto cups that are keto compliant, made with dark chocolate and other ingredients, and they feel like treats. Another option, I can't get my kid to drink magnesium citrate. What other options are out there for magnesium? There are so many flavors of magnesium now that I really think that a dissolvable powder is the way to go. If you simply can't do that, there are capsules, if your child swallows capsules. In our experience clinically, those don't create the same bowel motility response that the powders do, but I would go for it if that's your only option. I tend to, with those drinks, we tend to mix them into other things as well. So if you're using a flavored water, for example, that you can hide it that way. If the child is not on a ketogenic, a fruit juice is a good option. So I think that magnesium is available in lots of forms. I think there are even chewables, but the chewables are going to have components that likely you don't want in there. So ultimately, I think it's either to get magnesium specifically in, it's going to be continue to try to push the powder or go with capsules. And if we simply can't do that, then you'd be looking at increasing fiber content and using other agents to assist with bowel motility. I have some other questions, and we have time for a few more. One question we have is, does it have to be a keto diet? And I'm sorry, I'm unclear on the context for that one, but no, it doesn't have to be a ketogenic diet for anyone. My goal here really is sharing with you what this diet looks like and what you can accomplish with it. There are many different versions that we talked about in part 1 of this series that you might want to take a look at and see if there's a component there that if you sense and have a sense of how it could fit with your family and what it might be beneficial for. But really having a conversation with a clinician who can take responsibility for direction and management of dietary intervention for your child might be the best first step. Is this diet calorie restricted? And not necessarily. It depends on which version the prescribing clinician or the parent and supervising practitioner choose. So if you are looking at a ketogenic diet, the component that you're most concerned about is maintaining the ratio of total fat and protein intake, total protein and carbohydrate intake to fat intake. And as long as those ratios of intake are appropriate, and that's a highly, to follow a classical approach is technical. As long as those ratios are the same, no, there's no calorie restriction. In terms of a modified Atkins approach using MCT oil or other options to increase fat intake, the key component to manage is total grams of carbohydrate intake, and that's typically, depending on where you are in the program, the child's age, height, weight, size, 10 grams to 20 grams. And that's the figure that you look at, unless there's less focus on the ratio of those dietary macronutrients together. But no, it's not necessarily, it's not a calorie restricted intake in any way. If you look at its application in current use across the general population, people are often using it in a calorie restricted way, so that if your body is in ketosis and you are using ketones as fuel, you are also burning your body fat. And in that instance, people are using it as a weight management and weight loss technique. And that's a totally different application and approach than how we use it for neurological and gastrointestinal support for the kids that we serve. Does the ketogenic diet work the same in young adults and in children? And my answer to that is we don't have all the facts on that yet, but it seems that the more research that's coming out, it seems that it can be equally effective across the lifespan in the research data that we do have. So there are a number of studies out, and it's primarily in those with a documented seizure disorder, not necessarily autism spectrum disorder as well, but there is research on ASD specifically, and all of those citations were included in the first part of this webinar series, and I encourage you to go to the website and find that for future reference if you need it. Let's see, I think I have time for one or two more here. I noticed that you didn't speak about leaky gut. Would you agree that this is the first step that needs to be tested before starting the diet? So I absolutely think a GI evaluation is necessary, and I apologize that I didn't include this in my thought process, I guess, while explaining it. But I think typically in a baseline evaluation, that's absolutely a system and a core component of evaluation for care for us. And so some evaluation of GI status and what that means moving forward is absolutely critical. And from a clinical perspective, that's covered by most dietitians, nutritionists, clinicians managing this intervention for kids with autism and seizures at present. So it looks like I'm out of time. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you have other questions, you're welcome to email me directly at info@johnsons-center.org, and I'll get to them as soon as I can. Otherwise, I appreciate your time and attention, and I am happy to share this with you. I hope that it was useful. Thanks so much.